Yes, I am familiar with the peace conference between the Federal Nigerian government and the secessionist state of Biafra held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on August 13, 1968. The peace conference was an attempt to negotiate an end to the Nigerian Civil War, Biafran War, which began in 1967 and continued until 1970. The peace conference was held under the auspices of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, now known as the African Union, and chaired by Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Representatives from both the Federal Nigerian government, led by General Yakubu Gowon, and the secessionist Biafran state, led by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, attended the conference. The primary goal of the conference was to negotiate a ceasefire and find a peaceful resolution to the conflict, which had already caused significant loss of life and suffering, particularly in Biafra. The negotiations focused on issues such as humanitarian assistance, the return of refugees, and political autonomy for the eastern region. Unfortunately, the peace conference in Addis Ababa did not result in a resolution to the conflict. Both parties were unable to reach an agreement on the key issues, and the war continued for 2 more years. The Biafran War eventually ended on January 15, 1970, when Biafra surrendered to the Federal Nigerian government, and Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu went into exile. The end of the war marked the reintegration of the eastern region into Nigeria, but the effects of the conflict continue to be felt in the country to this day. The peace conference between the Federal Nigerian government and the secessionist state of Biafra held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on August 13, 1968, was a significant attempt to bring an end to the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War. The conference was convened under the auspices of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, which sought to promote unity and solidarity among African states and mediate conflicts in the continent. The negotiations were chaired by Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, and both sides were represented by high-ranking officials. General Yakubu Gowon, the Nigerian head of state, led the delegation representing the Federal Nigerian government, while Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, the leader of the secessionist Biafran state, represented Biafra. The peace conference aimed to address the key issues at the heart of the conflict, which had already led to widespread suffering and loss of life. The main points of discussion during the negotiations included ceasefire. Both parties were urged to agree on a ceasefire to halt the fighting and create an environment conducive to further negotiations. Humanitarian assistance. The conflict had caused a humanitarian crisis, particularly in Biafra, where millions of people were affected by famine and disease. The negotiations sought to establish mechanisms for delivering much-needed humanitarian aid to the affected populations. Refugees. The war had led to a massive displacement of people, and the conference aimed to address the issue of repatriation and the safe return of refugees to their homes. Political autonomy. One of the primary reasons behind the conflict was the demand for greater political autonomy for the eastern region, which was predominantly Igbo. The negotiations explored potential political solutions that could address these concerns and pave the way for the reintegration of Biafra into Nigeria. Despite the efforts of the OAU and the Ethiopian government to broker a peace agreement, the Addis Ababa Peace Conference ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. Both the Federal Nigerian government and the Biafran state were unable to reach a consensus on the key issues, and the conference ended without a resolution to the conflict. The Nigerian Civil War continued for 2 more years, ending on January 15, 1970, when Biafra surrendered to the Federal Nigerian government. The reintegration of the eastern region into Nigeria marked the end of the Biafran War, but the conflict's effects continued to reverberate in Nigeria's political and social landscape to this day. During the Nigerian Civil War, Biafran War, the British and United States governments did not directly mediate a ceasefire between the Federal Nigerian government and the secessionist state of Biafra. However, both countries were involved in various ways, particularly in terms of diplomatic efforts, humanitarian aid, and military support. The British government, under Prime Minister Harold Wilson, maintained a policy of supporting the Federal Nigerian government during the conflict, as Nigeria was a former British colony and an important trading partner, especially in the oil sector. Britain provided military support to the Nigerian government, including the supply of arms and equipment. Although the British government did not directly mediate a ceasefire, it did encourage negotiations between the two parties and supported the efforts of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, to broker a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The United States, under President Lyndon B. Johnson and later President Richard Nixon, took a more neutral stance during the conflict. The U.S. government focused on providing humanitarian assistance to the affected populations in Biafra through various relief organizations. While the United States did not directly mediate a ceasefire, it did encourage both sides to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict and supported the OAU's efforts in this regard. In summary, while the British and United States governments did not directly mediate a ceasefire in the Biafran War, they played various roles in diplomatic efforts, humanitarian aid, and military support. Both governments encouraged negotiations between the Federal Nigerian government and Biafra, and supported the OAU's attempt to broker a peaceful resolution to the conflict.